The winter of 1776 was not just cold. It was the chill of a revolution gasping for breath. 5 months after declaring independence with ringing words about liberty and equality, the American cause was collapsing under the weight of British power. General George Washington, commander of the Continental Army, had seen defeat follow defeat, each one worse than the last. His men, once driven by visions of freedom, now trudged through sleet and snow in silence, their faces hollow with hunger, their feet wrapped in rags. Entire regiments had melted away after the disastrous New York campaign. Those who remained were starving, sick and exhausted, their enlistment set to expire with the new year. Many planned to go home rather than die for a cause that seemed already lost. In New York, the British had struck with overwhelming strength. General William Howe, commanding tens of thousands of seasoned troops and backed by the world's most powerful navy, had driven the Americans from Brooklyn, then from Manhattan, and finally across the Hudson River. The defeats had been humiliating, and the retreat turned into a desperate flight through New Jersey. Washington's army, once numbering over 20,000, had dwindled to barely 3,000 effective soldiers. They crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania in early December, burning bridges behind them to slow pursuit. On the far side of the river they made camp, cold, hungry and demoralized, while the British established winter quarters across the river in occupied New Jersey. The political situation was just as bleak. The Continental Congress, which had fled Philadelphia in fear of capture, knew that without a dramatic reversal, the revolution would collapse before spring. British commanders believed victory was only weeks away. Loyalists, who had hidden their allegiance when the rebellion seemed strong, now openly welcomed the king's troops. In taverns from New York to Savannah, people spoke as if independence had been a foolish dream. Even in Washington's camp, the mood was grim. Soldiers cursed the Congress that had promised supplies and sent none. They cursed the officers who ordered them to stand guard without shoes. Some slipped away in the night, choosing to risk the noose for desertion rather than freeze to death in the snow. The British, confident the war was all but over, began to disperse their forces into winter quarters, a common practice in 18th century warfare. They believed the rebel army would disintegrate on its own once enlistments ended on December 31st. Hessian auxiliaries, German soldiers hired to fight for Britain, were stationed in key towns along the Delaware, including Trenton. Their commander, Colonel Johann Roll, dismissed rumors of an American counterattack as laughable. No half-starved, half-naked rabble would dare cross an ice-choked river and strike a garrison of trained soldiers in the dead of winter. Washington, however, understood that this complacency was his only chance. It was not courage that kept the American army together. It was necessity. Washington knew that one more defeat could end the revolution. The enlistment crisis loomed over every decision. Many of his best soldiers would be civilians again within weeks. Without a bold victory to restore faith in the cause, few would re-enlist. The fragile alliance of colonies could fracture under the weight of disappointment and fear. Britain's offers of pardons and protection for those who swore loyalty to the crown were tempting to men with families and empty bellies. Letters from the time speak to the depth of despair. Thomas Paine, whose pamphlet Common Sense had helped ignite the rebellion months earlier, now wrote a new series titled The American Crisis from the Freezing Camps. "These are the times that try men's souls," he wrote, words that Washington ordered read aloud to the troops. It was a plea not to give up when defeat seemed certain, a reminder that the struggle for liberty was supposed to be hard. But even stirring words could not hide the brutal reality. The American Revolution stood on the edge of extinction. Across the Delaware, the British slept soundly in their winter quarters. They celebrated their string of victories with fine wine and holiday feasts, certain that the next campaign season would finish the job. Washington watched them from the opposite bank, silently calculating. He had one chance left, a strike that would defy reason, break every rule of conventional warfare, and risk everything he had left. The revolution had been born in defiance, and if it was to survive, it would have to be saved the same way. In the darkness of December, with the snow beginning to fall, Washington began to plan the most daring move of his life. When the Declaration of Independence was signed in July 1776, the mood among the revolutionaries was one of cautious optimism. The colonies had thrown down their challenge to the most powerful empire on earth, and the Continental Army prepared to defend that bold claim on the field. Yet even as the ink dried on the document in Philadelphia, British ships were gathering off the coast, an armada so large it seemed to stretch across the horizon. By midsummer, more than 30,000 British troops and Hessian auxiliaries under General William Howe had assembled near Staten Island, supported by the Royal Navy's dominance at sea. It was the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever deployed, and its target was New York City, the strategic heart of the colonies. George Washington knew it would come, but he could not stop it. Washington positioned his inexperienced, poorly trained army on Long Island to defend Brooklyn Heights, hoping to block the British from gaining control of the city. It was a desperate gamble. Many of his soldiers had never seen battle before. They were farmers and tradesmen, armed with muskets and little discipline, facing veterans of the empire's global wars. On August 27, 1776, the British struck. Using superior numbers and tactical deception, Howe landed his forces on Long Island and executed a flanking maneuver through the Jamaica Pass, outmaneuvering Washington's defenses. The Battle of Brooklyn quickly turned into a rout. American lines collapsed under the assault, and only a risky nighttime withdrawal across the East River saved the Continental Army from annihilation. The loss of Long Island marked the beginning of a disastrous campaign. Washington, now on the defensive, abandoned Brooklyn and fortified Manhattan, determined to hold the city. But Howe pressed his advantage. On September 15th, British troops landed at Kip's Bay under a heavy naval bombardment. The American militia broke almost immediately, fleeing before the advancing Redcoats. Washington, furious at the panic, rode into the chaos himself and tried to rally his men, but it was no use. New York City fell with barely a fight, and the Continental Army retreated northward. There were brief moments of hope. At Harlem Heights, on September 16th, Washington's troops repelled a British probing attack, their first taste of success since the war began. The skirmish, though minor, boosted morale and proved that the Americans could stand and fight under the right conditions. But the victory was fleeting. Howe shifted his focus to cutting off Washington's retreat. In late October, he attacked the Americans at White Plains. Once again, the British outmaneuvered their enemy. Washington's lines were forced back, and he ordered another retreat, this time across the Hudson River into New Jersey. Each defeat bled away more men and more hope. Supplies were scarce, and discipline crumbled as soldiers deserted in growing numbers. The British, meanwhile, advanced methodically, capturing Fort Washington on Manhattan's northern tip in mid-November and taking more than 2,800 American prisoners. Days later, Fort Lee on the New Jersey side of the Hudson fell as well, forcing Washington into another hasty withdrawal. The retreat that followed was grim and relentless, a long, cold march across the length of New Jersey, with British and Hessian forces close behind. Washington's men trudged through mud and rain, sleeping in barns and fields, often without blankets or food. Many lacked shoes, their feet wrapped in cloth that offered little protection from the freezing ground. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical one. Civilians, who had once cheered the revolutionaries, now questioned their chances. Loyalist sentiment grew as British troops occupied New Jersey towns and promised protection to those who swore allegiance to the crown. In taverns and churches, whispers spread that the rebellion was over. Even within the army, despair took hold. Soldiers spoke openly of going home once their enlistments expired, convinced that continued resistance was pointless. Washington himself confessed in private letters that he feared the cause was lost. Yet amid the collapse, there were small mercies. The British advance, though relentless, was deliberate. Howe believed the rebellion was already broken and saw no need for a decisive high-risk engagement. That caution allowed Washington's battered army to survive. Crossing the Delaware River into Pennsylvania in early December, the Continental Army was reduced to a few thousand exhausted men, but it was still intact. Washington's leadership, his stubborn refusal to let the army dissolve entirely, was the only thing holding the revolution together. By the time the British settled into winter quarters across the river, the war seemed all but decided. New York was gone. New Jersey was in British hands. The Continental Army was a shadow of its former self. But Washington was not ready to surrender. The defeats of Brooklyn, Harlem Heights, and White Plains had taught him painful lessons about discipline, mobility, and patience. And though his army had been chased from the field again and again, it had not been destroyed. As the snows of December fell, Washington began to see a narrow path forward, one that would rely not on strength, but on surprise. By December 1776, the rebellion that had begun with fiery speeches and bold declarations now seemed destined to end in silence and ruin. The Continental Army, that once swelled with hope and volunteers, was now a broken force, beaten down by defeat and the unforgiving winter. The long retreat across New Jersey had stripped it of everything but the will to survive. Men who had marched proudly under banners of liberty now stumbled through snow and mud, their uniforms ragged, their muskets rusting from rain, their bellies empty. Many wore no shoes at all. Their feet, wrapped in scraps of cloth, left dark streaks of blood across the frozen ground as they crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. It was less an army than a procession of ghosts. The crossing itself was a miserable affair. Ice choked the river, and the ferries that carried the men and their few remaining cannons struggled against the current. The weather was bitter, with sleet cutting into faces already wind-burned and pale. On the far side, no tents awaited them, no stockpiles of food or fresh uniforms. They slept in barns and under makeshift shelters, huddled together for warmth. Sickness spread quickly, dysentery, fever, frostbite, and there were no supplies to treat it. Rations dwindled to almost nothing. Some men boiled strips of leather from their gear to soften and eat. For many, hunger gnawed worse than the cold. The mood in camp was as bleak as the weather. Each defeat had chipped away at their confidence, and now, with enlistment set to expire at the end of the month, even faith in the cause itself was failing. Men spoke openly of going home. They had fought and suffered for over a year, yet the British flag flew over New York and New Jersey, and Philadelphia seemed certain to fall next. Letters from home told of burned farms and captured relatives. It was hard to believe that liberty was worth the price when it seemed certain they would lose. Washington felt the weight of this despair more deeply than anyone. In his private letters, he admitted that the army was on the verge of dissolution and that the revolution might not survive the winter. He walked among the soldiers in the evenings, speaking with them quietly, listening to their fears and frustrations. He understood them. Many were farmers and laborers who had left their families and livelihoods behind. They had marched for months without pay, watched comrades die of disease, and fought battles where defeat was nearly always the outcome. And yet, he needed them to hold on a little longer. Without them, there would be no army. Without an army, there would be no revolution. The British, meanwhile, were convinced the war was over. General William Howe believed that the rebellion had been fatally wounded. Hessian troops settled comfortably into winter quarters in towns like Trenton and Bordentown, confident that the Americans would not attempt anything before spring. They celebrated their victories with drink and music, while their opponents shivered on the far side of the river. It was a mistake born of arrogance, but from their perspective it was understandable. The Americans were exhausted, starving, and demoralized. They had no reason to fight, and no strength left even if they wanted to, and yet in that valley of despair, a small ember of determination still burned. Some soldiers stayed not because they believed they could win, but because they refused to abandon the cause. Others stayed because Washington asked them to, and they could not bring themselves to disappoint the man who had shared their suffering. "We have been driven from post to post," Washington wrote, "but our spirits are not broken." It was not a statement of confidence so much as defiance, a refusal to let the revolution die quietly. The Continental Congress, aware of the Army's dire condition, sent what little help it could, promises of supplies, pleas for reinforcements, words of encouragement. But none of it could change the grim reality on the ground. The army was dwindling. The enemy was close. Time was running out. Even Thomas Paine, who had once stirred the colonies to action with common sense, now felt compelled to remind them why they fought. "These are the times that try men's souls," he wrote in December, his words read aloud to the troops. "The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country." The men listened in silence. Some nodded. Some simply stared into the snow. The shadow of defeat hung heavy over the Continental camp. It seemed to stretch beyond the river and across the land itself, a cold certainty that the dream of independence was slipping away. And yet, for all its weight, it did not crush them. In the darkness of that winter, as snow fell on blood-stained footprints and the last remnants of the army clung to life, a different resolve began to take shape. It was not hope, not yet, but something harder, born of desperation and pride. If the revolution was to end, it would not end without a final fight. And Washington was already beginning to think about where and when that fight might begin. On the eastern bank of the Delaware River, the British campaign of 1776 settled into a state of quiet confidence. After a string of decisive victories, from Brooklyn to White Plains and the capture of Fort Washington, the Redcoats and their German allies saw little left to fear. The Continental Army had been broken and chased across New Jersey like fugitives. Its numbers were dwindling by the day. By the time Washington's remnant force huddled in Pennsylvania, even British commanders believed the rebellion was in its final weeks. The enemy they had once considered reckless and unpredictable now appeared beaten, starving, and incapable of further resistance. With winter closing in, they turned to a more comfortable form of war: occupation. The British High Command divided its forces into winter quarters, occupying key towns and crossroads across New Jersey to secure supply lines and maintain control of the region. General William Howe, confident that Washington posed no immediate threat, withdrew the bulk of his army to the relative safety of New York City. Smaller detachments, British regulars and hired Hessian troops, were stationed in forward positions along the Delaware. These garrisons were not meant for battle, but for administration and surveillance, keeping an eye on the rebels across the river while enjoying the luxuries of captured territory. Farms and homes were commandeered for lodging, local supplies were requisitioned, and patrols were reduced to a routine schedule. The sense of urgency that had driven the campaign in autumn gave way to complacency. Nowhere was this more evident than in the small town of Trenton, where Colonel Johann Roll commanded a force of roughly 1,400 Hessian soldiers. A veteran officer who had fought in numerous European wars, Roll was brave and capable, but also stubborn and dismissive. To him, the American militia were little more than an armed mob, reckless, disorganized, and incapable of complex maneuvers. The idea that they might attempt an offensive in the dead of winter, across a frozen river, with their army in ruins, was unthinkable. He'd seen enough wars to know how soldiers behaved in winter. They rested, they regrouped, they waited for spring. The Americans, he believed, would do the same. If they survived that long, reports of enemy movement occasionally filtered into Trenton from loyalist informants and local scouts. Farmers spoke of unusual activity along the Pennsylvania shore. Small groups of armed men had been spotted near ferry crossings, but Rahl dismissed these warnings as rumors or exaggerated tales meant to curry favor with the British. Even when a loyalist messenger delivered a note on Christmas night warning that Washington might attempt a crossing, Rahl did not read it. According to some accounts, He slipped the message into his pocket while playing cards with fellow officers, intending to review it later. It remained unopened when the Americans attacked. The Hessians had good reason to feel secure. Their camp was well supplied, their discipline was strict, and their reputation for battlefield ferocity was well earned. They drilled daily, patrolled the outskirts of town, and maintained a confident watch over the quiet streets. Yet their guard was lowered in subtle ways. Sentries rotated less frequently. Outlying pickets were stationed farther from the town center. Officers took leave to visit nearby settlements. Soldiers drank and sang in the taverns of Trenton, celebrating the Christmas season and their string of victories. The Americans, they told one another, would never dare cross the river in such conditions. They were too weak, too hungry, too disorganized. Winter belonged to the king. Even British commanders in New York shared this sentiment. Howe himself believed the rebellion would collapse before the next campaign season. Once Washington's enlistments expired at the end of December, the Continental Army would simply cease to exist. Loyalist militias could handle whatever minor resistance remained. Until then, there was little reason to risk men or resources in the frozen countryside of New Jersey. The war could wait until spring, when British reinforcements would arrive and crush what remained of the rebel cause. This complacency was not born of ignorance, but of overconfidence, the inevitable arrogance of an empire that had never before lost a colonial war. The British saw themselves as professionals, heirs to a global military tradition, fighting against farmers and shopkeepers who should never have dared challenge them. And the Hessians, hardened by decades of continental conflict, considered the American struggle almost laughable. They had faced trained European armies with far greater skill and numbers. Surely this ragged band of rebels posed no real threat, but the war was not over, and Washington knew it. The very complacency that led the British and Hessians to settle so comfortably into their winter positions was the weakness he needed. The longer they believed the Continental Army incapable of action, the less prepared they would be for what was coming. In Trenton, soldiers warmed themselves by fires, sang familiar songs, and toasted a victory they believed already won. Across the icy river, in silence and darkness, a very different kind of plan was taking shape, one that would turn that false sense of security into their greatest vulnerability. The situation in the final days of December 1776 was nothing short of desperate. The Continental Army was a ghost of the force that had marched proudly into New York only months before. Barely 2,400 men remained fit for duty, and many of them were exhausted, sick, or on the verge of leaving once their enlistments expired on the last day of the year. Supplies were almost gone, ammunition was low, morale was at rock bottom, and the British, confident that the rebellion was finished, waited calmly across the river, convinced that the Americans would not, could not, strike again. George Washington knew that if he did nothing, the revolution would die before the snow melted. It was under those grim conditions that he called a council of war on December 23rd, and for the first time spoke aloud the plan that had been forming in his mind. The meeting took place in a small farmhouse in Pennsylvania, its windows covered to keep the candlelight from betraying their presence. Washington sat at the head of the table, his face drawn and expression severe. Around him were his most trusted officers, Nathaniel Greene, John Sullivan, Henry Knox, and others, men who had endured defeat after defeat by his side. They expected him to discuss winter quarters or possible defensive positions. Instead, he laid out a plan so audacious, so unlikely, that at first many believed they had misheard him. He proposed to recross the Delaware River on Christmas night, march 9 miles in freezing darkness, and launch a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton before dawn. The room fell silent as Washington spoke. Everyone present understood the risks. The river was thick with ice, and the weather was unpredictable. A crossing under those conditions was dangerous, even without the enemy on the other side. And if anything went wrong, if the ice broke, if the boats overturned, if the enemy was alerted, the result would be catastrophic. The army would be trapped on the wrong side of the river, with no escape and no reinforcements. It could mean the capture or destruction of the last effective American force. Yet Washington's resolve was clear. Doing nothing, he argued, was a slower but equally certain death for the revolution. A bold stroke, however improbable, was the only chance left. The plan reflected both Washington's strategic mind and his understanding of human nature. The British and Hessians believed the Americans incapable of offensive action. They were certain the cold, the river, and the condition of the Continental Army would keep them in place until spring. Washington intended to use that complacency against them. The timing, Christmas night, was chosen deliberately. He knew the Hessians would be celebrating, their guard lowered even further. A sudden attack in the early hours of December 26th could achieve not just a tactical victory, but a psychological one, proving to soldiers and civilians alike that the fight was not over. Some of his officers voiced concerns. General John Sullivan worried about the condition of the troops and the lack of supplies. Colonel Henry Knox pointed out the near impossibility of moving heavy artillery across the river in the dead of night. Others warned that the troops were exhausted, many without shoes, and questioned whether they could march 9 miles through snow and ice after the crossing. Washington listened patiently, but remained firm. "Victory or death," he declared, a phrase that would become the password for the mission. The stakes were absolute. If they succeeded, they could revive the cause and rally new enlistments. If they failed, the revolution would end on the banks of the Delaware. Preparations began immediately. Boats were gathered from up and down the river, including sturdy Durham boats, usually used for hauling iron ore. Experienced watermen from the Pennsylvania militia were recruited to guide them through the treacherous current. Oxen and horses were assembled to help drag artillery once they reached the far side. Washington divided his force into 3 columns for coordinated attacks, though poor weather would later force 2 of them to abandon their crossings. Every detail, from the timing of the march to the placement of the cannons, was considered. The men themselves sensed the weight of what was coming. Many wrote letters home, aware that they might not return. Fires were kept low at night to avoid detection. Silence was enforced in camp. And as Christmas approached, there was no talk of celebration, only preparation. The revolution's fate, they understood, would be decided not by grand strategy or overwhelming force, but by a single night's gamble, a desperate strike against overwhelming odds. For Washington, the decision was more than military. It was existential. He had spent months reacting to British moves, retreating again and again to preserve the army. Now he would seize the initiative. The river, the cold, the darkness, all the elements that made the plan so risky were the same ones that made it possible. If the revolution was to die, it would not die waiting for spring. It would rise one more time from the shadows of defeat and strike when the enemy least expected it. The weight of what Washington had set in motion settled over the camp like the bitter winter air. There was no rousing speech, no drums or trumpets to mark the coming action. Instead, there was silence. A grim, focused silence broken only by the sounds of axes splitting wood, boots crunching through snow, and the low murmur of men writing by candlelight. Many of them were drafting their wills, short and hurried letters to wives, parents, or brothers. They left instructions for farms they might never return to, words of love and apology, and prayers that someone would remember why they had fought. They did not know if they would survive the crossing, let alone the battle that awaited them on the far side of the Delaware. But they understood the stakes. If this mission failed, the cause for which they had endured so much would die with them, victory or death. That was the password Washington chose for the operation, simple, brutal, and honest. It was not meant as a rallying cry, but as a sober statement of reality. There was no third option. Either they would succeed and breathe new life into the revolution, or they would be destroyed, and with them would fall the last hope for American independence. The phrase spread quickly through the camp, whispered around fires, and scratched into the wood of muskets. It was less an order than a vow. Washington himself moved among his men with quiet purpose. He oversaw every detail personally, aware that one mistake, one miscalculation in timing or logistics, could doom the mission before it began. Boats were gathered from miles along the river, heavy Durham vessels capable of carrying dozens of men, and even field artillery across the current. Flat-bottom ferries were requisitioned for the horses and wagons. Experienced watermen from the Pennsylvania militia and local ferrymen were recruited to guide them through the treacherous, ice-choked waters. Washington left nothing to chance. Each vessel was assigned a precise time and place for launch, each regiment a specific order of embarkation. Artillery was a particular concern. Without cannons, they could not hope to hold Trenton once they took it. Colonel Henry Knox, whose booming voice and tireless work had earned the soldiers' respect, supervised the movement of the heavy guns. Oxen and horses were ready to haul them through the snow after the crossing. Everything had to happen in darkness and silence. Torches were kept shielded and orders were given in whispers. Pickets were posted along the river to keep watch for British patrols or curious civilians. The men were forbidden from lighting fires near the water, lest the glow betray their intentions. As preparations intensified, the mood of the army began to shift. Fear remained. It would have been impossible to erase it, but it was joined by a kind of grim determination. They were about to do something no one expected, something that would be spoken of for generations if they succeeded. For months they had been retreating, beaten and humiliated at every turn. Now at last they would strike back. Many of the men took comfort in the thought that they were not simply fighting for survival. They were fighting to prove that their cause still lived. The timing of the operation was carefully chosen. The crossing would begin on the night of December 25th, when the Hessians in Trenton would likely be celebrating Christmas and least prepared for battle. Washington planned to have the entire force across the river by midnight, giving them several hours to march the 9 miles to Trenton and strike before dawn. Everything depended on secrecy and speed. If the enemy learned of their movement, the plan would unravel before it began. In the days leading up to the operation, Washington reviewed the plan repeatedly with his officers. He rehearsed the sequence of movements, checked and rechecked the assignments, and even considered the weather, knowing that an unexpected storm could alter everything. His demeanor was calm and deliberate, but those closest to him could see the tension behind his eyes. He understood better than anyone how much was riding on this single operation. Success would revive the revolution and rally new enlistments. Failure would mean the end, not just for his army, but for the idea of American independence itself on the night before the crossing. As the men prepared their gear and shouldered their muskets, a strange stillness settled over the camp. There were no songs, no boasts, no careless laughter. The men spoke in low tones, if they spoke at all. Some prayed. Others stared into the darkness, thinking of home. Victory or death was no longer just a password. It was the truth they would carry with them across the frozen Delaware. A truth etched into every heart and every step. In a few hours, they would march into history, not because they were strong or well-armed, but because they had no choice but to fight. And if fate was kind, the world would remember what a desperate band of starving soldiers accomplished on a frozen river in the darkest winter of the war. Christmas Day in Trenton dawned cold but quiet. The streets of the small colonial town, lined with wooden houses and narrow lanes, were blanketed with snow. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of church bells drifted faintly through the frosty air. For the 1,400 Hessian soldiers stationed there, it was a day to relax and celebrate after a long and grueling campaign season. They were far from their German homes, but they made the most of it. Fires were lit, food and wine were shared, and the mood was one of ease and confidence. The war, it seemed, was nearly over, and the enemy, ragged, starving, and scattered, posed no real threat. Colonel Johann Rahl, the seasoned commander of the garrison, embodied that confidence. A veteran of European wars, he viewed the American rebels as little more than poorly trained peasants, men who might ambush supply trains or skirmish in the countryside, but lacked the discipline and strength to mount a serious attack. The defeats they had suffered in New York and New Jersey had confirmed his opinion. By late December, he believed Washington's army was no longer capable of organized resistance. Reports of movement across the river were dismissed as either rumors or desperate attempts to raise morale among the few rebels left. To Rawle, it was unthinkable that they would attempt any action in the dead of winter, let alone on Christmas night. The Hessians had settled comfortably into their winter quarters. Patrols were conducted, but they were routine and rarely encountered anything more than scattered militia. Officers spent the afternoon in conversation and card games, while soldiers feasted on sausages, bread, and beer. Music echoed from taverns where they toasted the king and laughed about their victories. The mood was relaxed, even careless. Sentries, dulled by cold and complacency, watched the tree-lined roads with little expectation of danger. The very idea that Washington's broken army might cross the ice-choked Delaware seemed absurd, yet warnings did come. Local loyalists, sympathetic to the British cause, brought word of unusual activity on the Pennsylvania shore. Boat movements, troop gatherings, strange silence in the rebel camps. Some suggested that an attack might be planned. A note, reportedly delivered to Rawle on the afternoon of December 25th, described preparations for a crossing that night. But the colonel, engrossed in a card game with fellow officers, slipped the message into his coat pocket without reading it. It remained there, unopened, as the hours passed and the sun sank below the horizon. Even without reading it, Rawle was aware of the rumors. But experience had taught him to trust what he could see, and what he saw was a beaten enemy with no strength left to fight. The Hessians had fought disciplined European armies in far harsher conditions. A group of poorly supplied farmers and tradesmen did not concern them. Their confidence was reinforced by British leadership, which had made no plans for defensive coordination or rapid reinforcement. General Howe in New York believed that winter itself was a weapon, that the river, the weather, and the rebels' own weakness would prevent any offensive. The campaign season was over, and the war would resume on British terms in the spring. As darkness fell over Trenton, the town grew still. Fires burned in hearths, casting warm light onto the snow-covered streets. Inside the officers' quarters, glasses clinked, dice rolled, and German carols were sung. Soldiers dozed in their bunks, some slightly drunk, others still awake and writing letters home. A few pickets paced their posts, stamping their feet to keep warm, peering out into the dark fields beyond the town. Nothing stirred. The Delaware River, though only a few miles away, might as well have been an ocean. The complacency that had taken hold of the Hessians was not arrogance alone. It was the natural result of months of dominance. They had faced the Americans again and again and watched them retreat every time. They had seen the enemy reduced to a pitiful remnant, too weak to hold a position or defend a town. Even if Washington dared to attempt a crossing, they reasoned, the elements would stop him before they did. Ice, snow, and night would do their work long before the Hessian muskets were needed, and so Trenton slept. Its defenders, disciplined soldiers who had once been relentless on the battlefield, now trusted the season and the situation to keep them safe. Colonel Rawle, unaware of the danger that was slowly and silently gathering across the river, retired for the night, confident that his command was secure. The Hessians had no reason to believe that history was about to shift on their doorstep, that in less than 24 hours, their quiet Christmas calm would be shattered by the thunder of cannons, the shouts of men, and the march of an enemy they had long since dismissed as defeated. The night of December 25th, 1776, fell heavy and cold over the banks of the Delaware River. Darkness came early, swallowing the snow-dusted landscape in silence, and with it came a biting wind from the north. The men of the Continental Army moved quietly toward McConkey's Ferry, the designated crossing point, their breath visible in the frigid air. There was no singing, no marching drums, only the muffled thud of boots on frozen ground and the occasional clatter of a musket against a cart. The moment had arrived. After weeks of despair, retreat, and doubt, the army was finally moving toward the offensive. But the night that was supposed to be their moment of boldness quickly became a battle against the elements themselves. The weather, which had been cold but bearable during the day, turned cruel as night deepened. Snow began to fall again, fine and sharp, soon thickening into freezing rain that soaked uniforms and stiffened fingers. The wind howled through the leafless trees along the riverbank, cutting through layers of cloth and wool. Visibility dropped, and lanterns had to be shielded to avoid detection. It was, in every way, a night that should have stopped an army from moving, and yet Washington pressed on. He knew this was their only chance. Surprise depended on speed and silence, and every hour that passed increased the risk that the Hessians would learn of their approach. The crossing operation was a masterpiece of improvised logistics. Dozens of heavy Durham boats, broad, flat-bottomed vessels normally used to transport iron ore, had been gathered for the task. They were built to handle weight, and they would be needed. Each one was loaded with clusters of soldiers, muskets slung over their shoulders, faces wrapped against the cold. Flat-bottomed ferries were reserved for the horses and artillery, the most difficult and dangerous part of the operation. Henry Knox, the tireless artillery commander, supervised the movement of the cannons, massive field guns that had to be rolled onto the boats with ropes and manpower, then carefully balanced to keep them from capsizing. The river itself was the greatest enemy of the night. Sheets of ice floated downstream, colliding with the boats and threatening to overturn them. Men wielded poles and oars, not just to steer, but to push chunks of ice away from the hulls. The current was strong and unpredictable, forcing the pilots, many of them experienced watermen from Pennsylvania, to fight every yard of the journey. Even the most skilled among them struggled in the darkness, their hands numb and their breath freezing against their faces. Progress was slow, far slower than planned. Washington had hoped to have all troops across by midnight, but midnight came and went with hundreds still waiting on the Pennsylvania shore. The delay was dangerous. Every hour lost on the river meant less time to march to Trenton before dawn. If daylight found them still on the move, the element of surprise, the very heart of Washington's plan, would be gone. Yet there was no choice but to continue. Men slipped on the icy riverbanks as they pushed boats into the water. Horses panicked at the unfamiliar motion, and soldiers struggled to calm them. Artillery pieces, each weighing thousands of pounds, creaked and groaned as they were ferried across, threatening to tip the boats with every wave. The soldiers who had already crossed huddled on the far bank, stamping their feet and blowing into their hands to keep warm, their silhouettes lit only by the dim glow of covered lanterns. Through it all, Washington remained calm and focused. He moved among the men, encouraging them, helping coordinate the loading and unloading, and quietly reminding his officers of the stakes. His presence, steady and composed, seemed to anchor the operation. Even those who doubted the plan found themselves reassured by his resolve. If their commander, who knew better than anyone how much depended on this night, could stand unmoved by the cold and chaos, then so could they. Hours passed. Midnight became 2, then 3. The schedule was shattered, but the crossing continued. Men who had once doubted they could even make it to the river now found themselves standing on the New Jersey shore, muskets in hand, snow and ice clinging to their coats. Exhaustion etched itself into every face, but no one spoke of turning back. They had come too far for that. The last boats carried Knox's artillery, dragged up the bank by teams of oxen, the wheels grinding against frozen earth. By the time the final gun was across, the eastern horizon was beginning to lighten, though dawn was still hours away. It was long past the planned timetable, but they had done it. Against wind, rain, ice, and darkness, Washington's army, the battered remnant of a revolution on the edge of collapse, had crossed one of the most treacherous rivers in America in the dead of winter. Ahead of them lay 9 miles of frozen road and an enemy that did not expect them. The hardest part, Washington knew, was still to come. But for now, they had overcome the river, and with it perhaps the shadow of defeat that had hung over them for months. The Delaware River that night was not just an obstacle. It was a force that seemed determined to destroy them before they even reached the enemy. As the wind howled across its surface and freezing rain lashed at their faces, the soldiers of the Continental Army pushed on, their bodies aching and hands raw from the effort. Chunks of ice, some the size of barrels, floated downstream, colliding with the sides of the heavy Durham boats. Men leaned over the edges, shoving the ice away with long poles to keep the vessels from capsizing. The current was swift, swirling and unpredictable, and every inch of progress came at the cost of backbreaking effort. Yet not a single man turned back. They were fighting more than the river. They were fighting the despair that had shadowed them for months, and on that night they refused to let it win. The crossing, already behind schedule, grew more grueling with each hour. The sleet soaked through coats and stiffened into ice on sleeves and collars. Water pooled at the bottom of the boats, freezing around their boots. Hands grew so numb that soldiers had to be helped back to their feet when they stumbled. And still they worked, silently, deliberately, as if the success of the revolution depended on every push of an oar and every shove against a drifting slab of ice. For many of them it did. Each man knew that if the mission failed, there would be no second chance. If they turned back now, the cause they had bled and starved for would die before the new year began. Washington moved constantly among the troops, his figure illuminated only by the faint light of covered lanterns and the occasional spark from an iron-shod boot on frozen rock. He said little, but his presence was enough. When men faltered, he was there to steady them. When boats slipped sideways in the current, he was the one shouting for ropes and hands to pull them back in line. Even in the coldest hours of the night, his calm was unshaken. He knew the risks. He had calculated them all. But he also knew that hesitation would kill them faster than the river ever could. The hardest task of all was moving the artillery. Without it, the plan would fail. The cannons were not just weapons. They were the backbone of the coming attack. Colonel Henry Knox oversaw the process, his booming voice rising above the wind as he directed teams of men and oxen. Each cannon, weighing thousands of pounds, had to be rolled onto a ferry, balanced carefully against the shifting weight of the ice and current, then dragged up the steep, frozen bank on the far side. The work was slow and brutal. Oxen strained against their harnesses, hooves slipping in the mud and ice. Men pushed from behind, shoulders hunched, boots digging into the frozen ground. It took hours to move them a few hundred yards, but they did not stop. Knox, soaked to the skin and hoarse from shouting, refused to leave a single piece of artillery behind. By the time the last cannon reached the New Jersey shore, the sky was beginning to pale in the east, a faint hint of dawn still hours away. Exhausted soldiers collapsed against trees and wagons, their breath ragged and hands shaking. Some wrapped their arms around one another for warmth, while others simply stared at the river, almost unable to believe they had made it. Many had doubted the plan from the beginning. Some had believed it was madness to attempt a crossing in such weather. Yet here they were, every man, every horse, every gun. They had done the impossible. The final tally was remarkable. All 2,400 soldiers had crossed the Delaware. Not a single boat had been lost. The artillery, without which the assault would be hopeless, was in place. Even the animals, though exhausted, were accounted for. It was 4 a.m., hours later than Washington had planned, but the mission, against all odds, was intact. They were cold, wet, and hungry, but they were ready. In that frozen darkness, something had shifted. The river, once a symbol of their desperation, had become a testament to their resolve. These men, who had spent months retreating before superior British forces, had just accomplished one of the most difficult feats in military history. They had conquered nature itself, and in doing so, they had begun to believe again. The crossing was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a statement. They were not beaten. They were not broken. They would fight, and they would do so on their own terms. As Washington gave the order to form ranks and begin the march toward Trenton, there was no cheering, no triumphant speeches. The men simply tightened their belts, adjusted their muskets, and started forward into the cold. Their breath hung in the air, their boots crunched against the frozen road, and their hearts carried a single thought. If they could cross the Delaware, they could do anything. The first part of the impossible was done. Now came the part that would decide the fate of a nation. The land beyond the Delaware was as cruel as the river itself. Once the last boat had landed and the cannons had been hauled onto the New Jersey shore, there was no pause for rest or warmth. Washington gave the order to move immediately, and the column began its march toward Trenton. The sky was still dark, the air bitter enough to burn in the lungs, and sleet slanted across the landscape, stinging exposed skin like shards of glass. The men moved in silence, their breath rising in white clouds, their boots, or in many cases bare, rag-wrapped feet, crunching against the frozen ground. They had 9 miles to cover before dawn, and every step mattered. The march was a test of endurance that pushed even the most hardened veterans to their limits. Many of the soldiers were already exhausted from the crossing, their muscles aching from hours of rowing, pushing ice, and hauling artillery. Now they trudged forward through ankle-deep snow and muddy, frozen roads, their clothes soaked and stiff with ice. Frostbite set in quickly, numbing fingers and blackening toes. Some men collapsed along the roadside, unable to go any farther. Others leaned on their comrades for support, refusing to fall behind. Those who could no longer walk were lifted onto wagons or carried along by their brothers in arms. The column moved like a single organism, wounded but still alive, still advancing. Washington rode near the front of the line, his horse plodding slowly through the snow. His presence was a silent anchor. He spoke little, but the men drew strength from his calm, his unwavering focus. He seemed to feel neither the cold nor the exhaustion that plagued them all. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, on the town that waited beyond the darkness. It was as if the outcome of the war itself depended on the steadiness of his posture. And in many ways it did. If Washington faltered now, the army would follow. But he did not. He rode forward, steady and composed, as if the snow and wind were nothing more than minor inconveniences on the path to victory. The march was carefully organized despite the brutal conditions. Washington split the army into 2 columns to approach Trenton from different directions and cut off any escape. General John Sullivan led one column along the river road, while General Nathaniel Greene took the inland route. Each man knew his place, and each officer knew his objective. The plan required precise timing. Both columns had to arrive at Trenton at the same moment for the surprise to succeed. Every delay, every icy hill, every broken wagon axle, every soldier who stumbled and had to be helped along, threatened that delicate coordination. And yet the line kept moving. The night grew colder as they marched. The sleet turned to snow again, heavier now, obscuring the road ahead. Lanterns flickered in the wind, their light barely piercing the darkness. The soldiers' breath hung thick in the air, and the rhythmic crunch of hundreds of boots was the only sound that broke the silence. There were no songs, no shouts, no drums. It was a ghostly procession, an army that was supposed to be dead, now marching with grim purpose toward one last chance at redemption. Every mile seemed longer than the last. Fingers froze around musket stocks. Faces burned with wind and cold. Some men wrapped their coats tighter. Others stuffed bits of cloth into their shoes to ease the pain of frostbitten feet. But no one turned back. They had come too far to surrender to the weather now. They knew that somewhere ahead, Hessian soldiers were sleeping soundly, certain they were safe. They knew that if they reached Trenton before dawn, they could shatter that illusion, and with it perhaps turn the tide of the entire war. Dawn crept closer with every step. The eastern sky remained dark, but there was a faint hint of grey at the horizon. They were behind schedule. The delays at the river had cost them precious hours, but the element of surprise was still within reach. Washington knew the risks of attacking after sunrise, but he also knew that retreat was no longer an option. This was their moment, and it had to be seized, even if conditions were no longer perfect. When the column finally reached the outskirts of Trenton, the soldiers were nearly spent. Their clothes were frozen stiff, their faces drawn and pale, their hands trembling from exhaustion and cold. And yet they stood ready. They tightened their grip on their muskets, checked their powder, and waited for the signal to advance. They were an army forged by suffering, too small, too hungry, too cold to be taken seriously by the British, and yet more determined now than they had ever been. The march had nearly broken them, but it had not stopped them. The line, against all odds, was still unbroken, and as the first faint light touched the sky over Trenton, that line prepared to strike with the fury of men who knew they were fighting for the very survival of their cause. The first light of dawn on December 26 revealed a town still asleep, unaware that the course of a war was about to change within its narrow streets. Snow covered the rooftops of Trenton, muffling sound and softening the edges of the houses, and the frozen wind carried the scent of wood smoke from hearths where Hessian soldiers dozed comfortably after their Christmas celebrations. But beyond the quiet town, shadows moved through the trees and fields, thousands of American soldiers advancing silently into position. They had marched all night through ice and darkness to reach this point, and now, as the church bells marked the morning hour, their long, desperate journey was about to erupt into fire. At precisely 8 a.m., Washington gave the order. The army split into two columns, just as he had planned, converging on the town from the north and the west to trap the garrison inside. Nathaniel Greene's men swept down the Pennington Road, while John Sullivan's column moved in from the river. The first sound of battle came from the artillery. Colonel Henry Knox, his cannons finally in place after the brutal crossing and march, opened fire on the town. The thunder of iron shattered the morning calm as round shot smashed into houses and splintered fences. The people of Trenton awoke to a nightmare. Within moments, Hessian soldiers were stumbling into the streets. Still half-dressed, muskets clutched in shaking hands. The attack was so sudden and overwhelming that for a moment the Hessians could not comprehend what was happening. Colonel Johann Rall, still recovering from the night celebrations, was roused from bed with reports that enemy troops were inside the town. At first he refused to believe it. The Americans had been broken, scattered, incapable of organized attack, or so he had thought. But as the cannon fire grew louder and musket volleys cracked through the icy air, the reality became undeniable. The rebels were here, and they were attacking in force. Chaos spread quickly through the garrison. The Hessians tried to form ranks, but their units were scattered and unprepared. Officers shouted conflicting orders as soldiers scrambled to find their equipment. Drums beat frantically as they attempted to rally in the town square. But Knox's artillery was already trained on the streets, blasting their positions with deadly accuracy. American infantry poured into Trenton, advancing block by block, firing from behind fences, walls, and houses. The Hessians, many without time to load their weapons properly, fired sporadically before falling back under pressure. Washington, riding near the front, directed the advance with calm precision. His plan was working perfectly. The two columns were closing the trap, cutting off every possible escape route. To the north, Greene's men pushed the Hessians back toward the center of town. To the south, Sullivan's troops blocked the road to Princeton, preventing reinforcements from arriving or the garrison from fleeing. Every street became a battleground as the Continental Army pressed forward, their resolve hardened by weeks of defeat and despair. This time, they would not retreat. Colonel Rall, determined to salvage the situation, mounted his horse and attempted to rally his men. He rode through the streets, shouting orders and waving his sword, trying to organize a counterattack. But it was too late. The Americans had the initiative, and their fire was relentless. Rall himself was struck by musket fire, tumbling from his horse mortally wounded. With their commander down, the Hessians' resistance began to crumble. Small groups fought on stubbornly, but without coordination or leadership, their efforts were doomed. The battle lasted less than an hour, but in that hour the world turned upside down. The soldiers who had spent weeks retreating and running from the British now held the upper hand. The enemy that had been so certain of its invincibility now fought desperately to survive. Cannon fire echoed down Trenton's narrow streets. Musket smoke hung thick in the frozen air, and the cries of the wounded and captured filled the town square. The Americans pressed forward with a discipline and determination that surprised even themselves. For the first time in months, they were not merely surviving, they were winning. By the time the last Hessian unit laid down its arms, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Washington's gamble had paid off. The element of surprise had shattered the enemy's complacency, and the carefully coordinated assault had trapped the garrison before it could mount a proper defense. The town that had seemed so secure on Christmas Day was now firmly in American hands. What had begun as a desperate plan to save a dying revolution had exploded into a stunning victory. Washington surveyed the aftermath from horseback, the acrid smell of gunpowder still lingering in the air. He knew the battle was not over, the war would rage on for years to come, but in that moment he had achieved what many had thought impossible. His ragged, starving army had crossed a frozen river, marched through a night of suffering, and struck with the precision of a professional force. Trenton was theirs, and with it came something even more valuable than prisoners or supplies: belief. The revolution, once thought finished, had proven it still had fight left, and that fight was far from over. The streets of Trenton were a storm of confusion and violence as the battle unfolded. Snow and sleet mixed with gunpowder smoke, turning the crisp winter air into a choking haze. The thunder of cannon fire shook the town's wooden houses, and musket balls shattered windows and splintered doors. Hessian soldiers, still half-dressed from their interrupted Christmas celebrations, stumbled into formation, clutching their weapons and trying to make sense of the chaos engulfing them. Shouts in German echoed through the narrow streets, orders, pleas, curses. But they were drowned out by the relentless rhythm of American volleys, closing in from every direction. Colonel Johann Rall, the veteran commander who had dismissed the possibility of an attack just hours earlier, now found himself riding through streets he could barely recognize. Smoke obscured his view, and the ringing of alarm bells mingled with the screams of panicked civilians. Rall shouted, himself hoarse, waving his sword, trying to pull his scattered troops together into some semblance of order. "To the square! Rally to the colors!" he shouted, urging his men to regroup. But the garrison was disorganized and unprepared, their defensive positions overrun before they could properly form. In house after house, Americans poured through doors and windows, taking control of strong points and firing from behind walls and fences. Every time the Hessians tried to form a line, it was broken apart by another wave of musket fire. Rall attempted one final counterattack, leading a contingent of soldiers toward the center of town, where he hoped to regroup and push the Americans back. He spurred his horse through a hail of musket fire, his voice carrying above the din as he tried to rally his men. But just as he reached the intersection near King Street, a musket ball struck him in the side. He slumped forward in the saddle, blood soaking his coat. His aides rushed to his side, trying to lift him from the horse, but it was clear the wound was mortal. As he was carried into a nearby house, Rall reportedly asked to see Washington, perhaps to offer his sword or plead for the lives of his men. He would not live to do either. His fall marked the symbolic collapse of Hessian resistance. With their commander down, the remaining Hessian troops tried desperately to hold their positions, but the situation was hopeless. American infantry swarmed through alleys and side streets, cutting off one escape route after another. Sharp bursts of gunfire echoed from behind barns, fences and corners, where Continental soldiers had set up ambushes. Artillery positioned at key intersections raked the streets with grapeshot, preventing any organized retreat. The Hessians were trapped in their own town, surrounded on all sides by an enemy that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Panic set in. Some groups of Hessians surrendered in small clusters, throwing down their muskets and raising their hands. Others fled through backyards and gardens, only to be intercepted by American units waiting on the outskirts of town. A few tried to reach the Princeton Road to the north, but Sullivan's column had already sealed it off. Every attempt to break free ended in failure. The once proud garrison that had boasted of crushing the rebellion now fought simply to survive. The civilians of Trenton, caught in the middle of the battle, cowered in their homes as the fighting raged outside. Many had been loyal to the crown and had welcomed the Hessians as protectors. Now they watched in disbelief as the supposedly invincible soldiers were driven back house by house. Doors were kicked in as Americans searched for hidden troops. Muskets flashed in doorways. The town, that had been a quiet winter outpost just hours earlier, was now a battlefield. Every street corner a contested prize. By the 40-minute mark, it was clear the fight was over. The Hessians had no commander, no lines, and no hope of reinforcement. American troops had secured the high ground and blocked every road. Artillery thundered from key positions, and sharpshooters controlled the rooftops. Surrounded and outnumbered, the last organized pockets of Hessian resistance began to surrender. White handkerchiefs and flags were waved from windows. Soldiers dropped their weapons and stepped into the snow with their hands raised. The final shots echoed through the town, then faded into silence. When the smoke began to clear, Washington's plan stood complete. Trenton was encircled. Every path out of the town was sealed, every avenue of escape closed. The Hessians, once so certain of their safety, were captives. In less than an hour, a force that had seemed untouchable was crushed by an army they had believed incapable of even launching an attack. The humiliation was total. For the Americans, it was more than a military victory. It was vindication. Months of retreat and defeat had led to this moment, and now, standing in the streets of a captured town, they had proof that the revolution was far from over. The war's tide had not yet turned completely, but it had shifted, and for the first time in months it shifted in their favor. The last moments of the Battle of Trenton were less a fight and more a collapse. Once Colonel Johann Rall was carried from the field, bleeding and unconscious, the Hessian garrison's will to resist disintegrated. Scattered units, still trying to regroup in the town square, quickly found themselves surrounded. Cannon thundered from the corners of King and Queen Streets, tearing gaps in their formations before they could mount an effective counterattack. Musket fire poured from windows and alleyways as American infantry closed in from every direction. The disciplined ranks that had once marched across Europe in the service of their prince now dissolved into chaos, their officers shouting orders that no one could follow. Surrender came piecemeal at first, small groups throwing down their muskets and raising their hands, but within minutes it spread across the town. By the time the fighting ceased, nearly 900 Hessian soldiers had laid down their arms. The rest lay dead or wounded in the snow. For the Americans, the scale of the victory was staggering. They had expected a fierce and costly battle, one that might break their battered army, even if it succeeded. Instead, they had overwhelmed a professional garrison in less than an hour, capturing more than 2/3 of the enemy force. Even more astonishing, their own losses were minimal. Only 2 men killed in the engagement and a handful wounded. After months of crushing defeats, it was a reversal so dramatic that many soldiers could hardly believe what they had accomplished. Washington moved through the town slowly, his face composed but his eyes betraying the depth of his relief. Everywhere he looked, signs of the enemy's defeat were visible. Muskets, bayonets, and cartridge boxes lay scattered in the streets where Hessians had thrown them down. Soldiers stood under guard in silent ranks, their heads bowed, many too shocked to speak. Wounded men, American and Hessian alike, were tended in makeshift aid stations set up in houses and churches. The air was thick with the acrid smell of spent gunpowder and the bitter smoke of burning wagons. And beneath it all was the hum of a victorious army rediscovering its confidence. The material gains of the battle were as valuable as the victory itself. The Americans, who had been desperately short of supplies for months, suddenly found themselves with a windfall of weapons, ammunition, and equipment. Hundreds of muskets and bayonets were seized, along with much-needed powder and shot. Wagons, horses, boots, and uniforms, all the essentials that an army required to keep fighting, now belonged to Washington's troops. Stores of food and drink were confiscated from Hessian quarters and distributed among the starving soldiers. For men who had marched through snow with empty stomachs and bare feet, the sudden abundance was almost surreal. The psychological impact was even greater. For weeks, the Continental Army had been defined by retreat and defeat. They had been forced from New York, chased across New Jersey, and driven to the brink of collapse. Many soldiers had doubted that victory was even possible anymore. But here, in the streets of Trenton, those doubts vanished. They had taken on one of the most feared fighting forces in the world, professional European troops, well-trained and heavily armed, and they had won. They had done it not with overwhelming numbers or superior firepower, but with determination, surprise, and discipline. The victory proved that the British Empire was not invincible, and that the cause of independence was far from lost. For the Hessians, the defeat was humiliating. Captured officers were treated with courtesy, but the shock on their faces was unmistakable. They had believed themselves safe, secure in the assumption that the Americans were too weak and disorganized to strike. That arrogance had cost them everything. Colonel Rawle, gravely wounded, was taken to a house near the battlefield, where he reportedly asked to see Washington before he died. According to some accounts, he expressed regret for dismissing the warnings of an attack. He died later that night, a symbol of the overconfidence that had doomed his garrison. By midday, the battle was over, and Washington's army prepared to withdraw. He knew that British reinforcements from Princeton or New Brunswick could arrive at any time, and he had no intention of risking his exhausted troops in a larger engagement. The prisoners were rounded up and marched across the Delaware into Pennsylvania, where they would be held until exchanged. The captured supplies were loaded onto wagons, and the troops gathered for the long journey back to safety. As they marched out of Trenton, the men walked with a confidence they had not felt in months. The despair that had followed them from New York was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. They had stared defeat in the face and turned it into triumph. And though they knew that the war was far from over, they also knew that they had taken the first step toward changing its course. Trenton was not just a victory, it was proof that the revolution still had life in it. And from that moment on, the British would never again be able to dismiss the ragged Continental Army as a mere band of rebels. They had become something far more formidable, a force capable of winning. The news of what had happened at Trenton spread faster than any rider could carry it. By the time Washington's army had ferried its prisoners across the Delaware and settled into camp on the Pennsylvania side, word was already racing along the roads and through the towns of the colonies. At first, many refused to believe it. A ragged, half-starved army had crossed an ice-choked river on Christmas night, marched 9 miles through a snowstorm, and crushed a professional Hessian garrison in less than an hour. It sounded like a rumor, a fantasy born of desperation. But as the details were confirmed and the prisoner columns marched through the streets, disbelief turned into astonishment, and astonishment into a surge of hope that the rebellion had not felt in months. For weeks, the mood in the colonies had been one of despair. The defeats in New York, the humiliating retreats across New Jersey, and the shrinking size of the Continental Army had convinced many that independence was a doomed dream. Loyalist voices had grown bolder, calling for reconciliation with the Crown before further blood was shed. Even within the Patriot ranks, doubts had spread like a sickness. Men whose enlistments were about to expire planned to return home, convinced that the cause was lost. But the victory at Trenton shattered that fatalism in a single stroke. The impossible had been achieved. The army that had been written off as broken and finished had struck back and won. Newspapers carried the story from New Hampshire to Georgia, each retelling growing more dramatic than the last. Pamphleteers described the night crossing in heroic terms, painting Washington and his men as figures of legendary endurance. Town criers read accounts aloud in village squares, and church bells rang in celebration. Farmers paused their work to discuss the news in hushed, excited tones. Merchants reopened lines of credit to support the army. And in taverns, where only weeks before men had spoken of surrender, talk turned again to victory and independence. The psychological effect was profound. Trenton did not simply lift morale. It changed the way Americans saw themselves. It also transformed the way they saw their enemy. For much of the war's early stages, the British Army had seemed unbeatable. Its soldiers were professional, disciplined, and equipped with the finest weapons and supplies the world could provide. Its navy dominated the seas, and its empire spanned continents. Against such power, the Americans had appeared hopelessly outmatched. But the Battle of Trenton cracked that image wide open. A small, poorly equipped army, without proper uniforms, often without shoes, had defeated a contingent of one of Europe's most feared military forces. It was proof that the British were not invincible, that they could bleed and that they could lose. The impact was immediate and tangible. Across the colonies, men who had previously hesitated to enlist now came forward in large numbers. Veterans who had planned to leave the army at the end of the year chose to stay, inspired by the sudden reversal of fortune. New regiments were raised and militia units reported record numbers of volunteers. In some towns, men who had once mocked the revolution signed up, ashamed to remain on the sidelines after hearing what Washington's soldiers had accomplished. The Continental Army, which only days earlier had been on the brink of disintegration, began to grow stronger again. The victory also had diplomatic consequences. News of the success reached France, where American representatives had been seeking support for their cause. European observers, who had doubted that the rebellion would last into the new year, took note of the boldness and discipline displayed at Trenton. The battle demonstrated that the Americans could win under impossible circumstances, a critical proof of credibility that would later help secure foreign alliances and supplies. But perhaps the most significant change was in Washington himself and the men who followed him. The victory validated his strategy of perseverance, of refusing to risk everything in one decisive battle, but striking hard when the enemy least expected it. It also bonded the army together in a way that no amount of drilling or discipline could have done. They had endured hardship and humiliation together, and they had emerged victorious. That shared triumph forged a sense of purpose that would sustain them through the long years of war still to come. By the time the year ended, the revolution had been transformed. Only days earlier, it had teetered on the edge of collapse, its armies scattered and its supporters demoralized. Now it burned with new life. The men who had nearly given up now spoke of liberty with renewed conviction. The farmers and merchants who had doubted now offered supplies and loans, and the soldiers who had thought the fight hopeless now marched with their heads held high. The victory at Trenton was more than a military success. It was a resurrection. The revolution, nearly extinguished by defeat, was reborn in the snow and smoke of that winter morning. And with that rebirth came a new and dangerous truth for the British Empire. The spirit of rebellion, once reignited, would not be easily put out again. The victory at Trenton was more than a single triumph. It was the spark that set an entire campaign in motion. George Washington understood immediately that one battle, however dramatic, would not be enough to sustain the momentum that had been so desperately won. The British still held vast swathes of New Jersey and New York. Their armies remained larger, better equipped, and better supplied than his. If the revolution was to survive, the blow struck at Trenton had to be followed by another. It had to become part of a chain of victories that would shift the strategic balance of the war. And so, as the snow continued to fall and the year came to a close, Washington began to plan his next move. He did not have long to wait. British General Charles Cornwallis, furious at the humiliation of Trenton, assembled a large force to crush the Continental Army once and for all. On January 2, 1777, he marched south from Princeton with thousands of troops, determined to corner Washington's army along the Assunpink Creek near Trenton. The situation was perilous. Washington's men were exhausted from days of marching and fighting, and reinforcements were still trickling in. But the commander had no intention of repeating the mistakes of earlier campaigns. He entrenched his forces behind the creek, using the terrain to his advantage, and repelled multiple British assaults throughout the afternoon and evening. As night fell, Cornwallis prepared for a final attack at dawn, confident that the Americans were trapped, but Washington had no intention of waiting to be attacked. In one of the most brilliant maneuvers of the war, he ordered his army to slip away under cover of darkness. Campfires were left burning to convince the British that they remained in place, while muffled wheels and whispered orders guided the troops quietly around the enemy flank. By morning, Cornwallis awoke to find his quarry gone, and marching rapidly toward Princeton, where a smaller British force was stationed. On January 3rd, the Americans struck again. The Battle of Princeton was brief but fierce. At first, British regulars managed to push back the American advance, threatening to undo Washington's bold plan. But the commander himself rode into the thick of the fighting, rallying his troops and steadying the line. Under his direction, the Continental Army counterattacked and broke the British formation. By the time the smoke cleared, the enemy was in retreat. Hundreds were captured, and the rest fled north toward New Brunswick. It was another decisive victory, one that proved Trenton had not been a fluke. The Continental Army could now defeat the British in the open field, not just in surprise attacks. The back-to-back victories at Trenton and Princeton transformed the war's strategic landscape. British forces were forced to abandon much of southern New Jersey, retreating to defensive positions closer to New York. More importantly, the psychological balance of the conflict shifted decisively. The Americans, who only weeks earlier had seemed on the verge of total collapse, now held the initiative. The myth of British invincibility, shattered at Trenton, lay in ruins by the time the smoke cleared at Princeton. Across the colonies, faith in the cause surged once more. Men who had hesitated to enlist now volunteered. Foreign observers, who had doubted the rebellion's chances, began to take it seriously. What had begun as a desperate gamble was becoming a real war for independence. Washington's winter campaign became a textbook example of how leadership, audacity, and timing could overcome overwhelming odds. He had taken an army that was starving, poorly equipped, and demoralized and turned it into a force, capable of striking fear into one of the most powerful militaries on Earth. His decision to cross the Delaware, made in the face of almost universal skepticism, was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a declaration that the revolution would not die quietly. Every element of the operation, from the midnight crossing to the relentless follow-up at Princeton, demonstrated that resolve could triumph where resources could not. In the weeks that followed, the Continental Army settled into winter quarters in Morristown, New Jersey, from which it could threaten British supply lines and launch new operations in the spring. For the first time in the war, the initiative no longer belonged exclusively to the Crown. The colonies, still fragile and divided, now had proof that they could stand against the Empire and win. The Delaware crossing had begun as a desperate act of survival. It ended as a turning point in the American Revolution. In a matter of days, Washington transformed the narrative of the war from one of inevitable defeat to one of determined resistance. The victories at Trenton and Princeton did not end the conflict. Years of hardship and bloodshed still lay ahead, but they ensured that there would be a conflict to fight. They kept alive the dream of independence and showed the world that courage and resolve could achieve what seemed impossible. Against the weight of an empire, a nation had taken its first true steps toward freedom, steps that began on a frozen river and marched forward into history.